All right. Hello. Today, what we'll go over are the different types of equipment and glassware that we use in a chemistry class. And so, the goal of today is being familiar with the different equipment, and so that when it comes time to our first lab, you'll be able to identify and be able to use the correct different type of equipment. And so, that is the main purpose of today. A lot of this equipment and glassware are things we use throughout the year. And so just being able to have this in your notes is something that will be very helpful for you. Because I think something that is very common that happens in this class is that people forget or don't remember what the different types of equipment look like. And so having this thing down will be something that will be very helpful for you throughout the year. And so today, what we'll go over are four different types of glassware. And so that'll be the first four listed here. So we have the graduated cylinder, the beaker, the Erlenmeyer flask, and the burette. And then the last piece of equipment that we use in this class quite often is a scale. And so, what are these things? What do they look like? And what are their purposes and their benefits and, I guess, their pros and cons? So the first thing that we're going to go over is the graduated cylinder. So this is the long, narrow cylinder with the funnel tip, I guess, at the end. And so the easiest way to identify if it's a graduated cylinder is that there is usually a base at the bottom of the cylinder that makes it so that it could stand on a table. And so the purpose of this is to measure volumes of liquid. And so when we mix things or have to measure things from a container, we end up using a graduated cylinder for the most part. And so you pour it into the graduated cylinder and you use the lines to record and measure the amount of liquid that you use. And so the benefit of this is that they're very accurate and precise for measuring. Because of all of these lines, you can actually read how much you're actually using. The downside of a graduated cylinder is that because it has a base, you can't really use it for anything besides measuring. And so, like I said, the easiest way to identify if it's a graduated cylinder is that it's a long, narrow cylinder and that it has a base at the bottom. The next thing that we use a lot of times in this class is a beaker. And so these end up being the wide, short cylinder, and they end up usually having a lot less lines. The purpose of this is that they hold liquid and are for very good for general purposes. What I mean by that is that they're good for like mixing, for heating, and end up a lot of the times very good for conducting experiments in. So if you had to mix multiple liquids together, you'd kind of pour them into a beaker and then you'd be able to observe the chemical reaction within the beaker. The downside of a beaker, though, is that they're not very good for measuring. So, because they have a lot fewer lines, they are actually not very accurate or precise. And these lines are kind of, or not very accurate or precise themselves. And so, this is a bad tool for measuring liquids or volumes of things. Next, we have something called an Erlenmeyer flask. And these are the easiest to identify because they look like a triangle. So they're the container or flask that looks like a triangle. And so they have very similar purposes with a beaker, which means that they're very good for holding liquid and for general purposes. The biggest pro of this in comparison to a beaker is that it's very good for mixing and swirling. And so if you end up having to swirl a solution in a Erlenmeyer flask, the triangular shape makes it so it doesn't spill over. And so we use this quite often in this class whenever we have to mix multiple things together without using something like a stirring rod or something to stir it around with. Once again, they also have the same downside of a beaker, which is that they're not very good for measuring, and that's probably because they have a lot fewer lines, and also these lines, once again, are usually not very accurate themselves. And lastly, our last piece of equipment or glassware that we use is the burette. And so this is a long cylinder with a tip, and so this is just a really long glass cylinder that has a tip at the bottom. And so the purpose of a burette is that it measures the amount of liquid that you pour. And so what you do is that you usually fill up the burette And then as you pour the liquid, you measure the difference in those numbers. And so the purpose of this is that this is usually the most accurate and most precise measuring tool that we use in terms of glassware. And so these are very helpful for us in multiple labs, and you'll kind of start to see them as we approach the second semester of this class. And lastly, the last piece of equipment that we use a lot of the times in this class is a scale. And so, obviously, hopefully, most of you guys know what the scale is used for. It's to measure mass. And the purpose of this is that a lot of the times in the class, we have to measure the mass of things before and after, especially when we're measuring things that are not liquids. And so instead of telling you what a scale is used for, I think it's most important to tell you how to use one. And so a lot of the times we end up having these Flynn scientific scales that look just like the picture right here. And so the easiest way to go over this is just how to use one properly. And so if you look at the picture, there's this transparent cover. So the first thing you have to do is lift the cover up, and so that you could properly measure. So there's like a metal disc underneath this container. That is where you're going to be measuring things and putting things on for the scale. And so the first thing after, or the next thing after you do, after you lift the lid, is that you press the on or off button. And so it should start flashing some letters or numbers to start showing that it's initializing the starting sequence. And then the most important thing is you have to wait a couple of seconds until it reads usually 0.00 Gs. That is the most important thing because a lot of the times students end up putting or measuring the mass of things before it starts to read 0, and that ends up recording a wrong mass. And then what ends up happening is sometimes when it starts off or throughout the lab, when you have nothing on the scale, it does not read exactly 0.00. And so something that can help is pressing the 0 or tare button so that it resets the scale to 0 when there's nothing on it. And so a lot of the times, like I said, as you kind of go throughout a lab, it won't read 0.00 at a certain point. And so just pressing that button before you do any measurements is something that will be very helpful. And then lastly, it will always be in the measurement of grams or G on the scale. And obviously, if it doesn't measure those things or doesn't show that it has a different unit, please let me know. I will fix the scale for you so that you can actually use the scale properly. And so those are the different types of equipment that we use, the different glassware that we use. And so hopefully throughout this year, you get familiar with those pieces of equipment, what they're good at, what they're not so good at, so that as you kind of approach throughout the year, you are familiar with the equipment that we use. All right, take care.